This story is titled, My Golden Sibling Secretly Emptied the Safe with Money from My Terminally Ill Child's Treatment. Stole it for a cruise holiday with their fiancé, saying it's cooler than supporting a loser like me. So I had to call police on my own family member, they got arrested, and now mom and dad are begging me to drop the charges. Sup Reddit, my name is Derek, and I'm 29 years old. I work as an HVAC technician for a commercial company here in Tampa, pulling down decent money fixing air conditioning systems for office buildings and retail spaces. It's honest work, and I'm good at what I do. I'm also a single dad to my 7-year-old son Blake. His mother decided that motherhood wasn't fulfilling her artistic journey, so she moved to Miami with some wannabe musician when Blake was barely 2. I haven't heard from her since, and honestly, we're better off without the drama. Here's the thing about Blake that changes everything about our lives. He was born with something called hypoplastic left heart syndrome. Basically, the left side of his heart didn't develop properly when he was in the womb. Imagine trying to pump blood through your entire body with half an engine. That's what my little boy has been dealing with his entire life. This kid has been through more doctor visits than most people have in their lifetime. Cardiologists, pediatric surgeons, endless monitoring appointments, EKGs, echocardiograms, you name it. But Blake is tough as nails. He never complains about any of it. He just deals with getting completely winded from walking upstairs to his bedroom. He deals with turning blue around his lips when he pushes himself too hard playing with other kids. He deals with having to sit down and rest when other children his age are running around without a care in the world. For the past 6 years, ever since the doctors explained what Blake would need for a normal life, I've been saving every single penny I could squeeze out of my paycheck. Every overtime shift, every weekend emergency call, every dollar that wasn't absolutely essential for keeping us alive. It all went into one account with one purpose: the Norwood procedure. It's a 3-stage heart surgery that would basically rebuild Blake's entire cardiovascular system from the ground up. Stages 1 and 2 were covered by insurance when he was a baby, thank God. But stage 3, the final surgery that would give him a completely normal life, insurance decided was elective. Their reasoning? Because he wasn't literally dying right this second, they considered it optional. The price tag for giving my son a chance at a normal childhood: $118,000. Yeah, you read that right. $118,000 for my kid to have a shot at playing sports, running around with his friends, maybe not worrying about dropping dead before his 8th birthday. So I did what any father would do. I grinded. I worked every single overtime shift that became available, no matter how exhausted I was. I picked up weekend emergency calls when other techs wanted to stay home with their families. I even started doing side work installing AC units for new construction companies on my days off, just to squeeze out a few more dollars. My truck has 195,000 miles on it and sounds like a diesel tractor when I start it up, but it runs, and that's what matters. I moved Blake and me into a cheaper apartment, basically a concrete box with windows, but it's clean and safe, and that's all we need. Every luxury, every comfort, every unnecessary expense got cut from our lives. This was about Blake's future, not our present comfort. By October, after 6 years of this relentless saving, I had $122,350 sitting in a high-yield savings account. My sister Victoria, who's 30 years old, had actually helped me set that account up during her brief stint working at a credit union a few years back. She understood how important this money was and had been supportive of my efforts to save for Blake's surgery. Victoria has always been what you'd call the golden child of our family. She looks like she just stepped off a magazine cover, with the kind of effortless beauty that opens doors and makes people want to help her. Somehow, she's convinced everyone in our extended family that she's a successful entrepreneur, even though her businesses change more often than most people change their underwear. Currently, she's gotten into some wellness coaching thing with her boyfriend Chase, this guy who constantly talks about energy alignment and spiritual vibrations. They charge people $180 an hour to tell them their chakras are blocked or that their aura needs cleansing. It's complete nonsense, but apparently there are enough gullible people with disposable income to keep them living comfortably. 2 weeks before Blake's scheduled surgery date, November 20th, a date I'd been counting down to for months like it was Christmas morning, I logged into my savings account to initiate the payment transfer to the hospital. The surgery was finally happening. After 6 years of sacrifice and saving, my son was going to get his life back. The screen loaded and my world collapsed. Balance: $47.83. I refreshed the page 6 times, thinking the bank's website was glitching or that I'd somehow logged into the wrong account. My hands were shaking as I called the bank's 24-hour customer service line. I gave them my account number, my social security number, my mother's maiden name, every piece of verification they required. The representative confirmed what I was seeing with cold, professional detachment. A wire transfer had been executed 3 days prior. Amount: $122,267.17. The transfer had been authorized with proper two-factor authentication from a recognized device, which meant whoever did this had access to both my login information and my phone. The money had been sent to an account in the Cayman Islands. Only one person besides me had ever had any access to that savings account. Only one person knew my security questions because she'd helped me set them up in the first place. The same person who'd been posting Instagram stories from the Bahamas for the past week, showing off luxury resort pools and private beach dinners. I sat in my truck outside the bank for 20 minutes with the engine running, just staring at my phone screen. The reality of what had happened was slowly sinking in, and I felt like I was drowning. My kid's one shot at a normal life, gone. Stolen by the person I'd trusted most after Blake himself. That's when I made a decision. Victoria was about to learn something important. Some people don't just roll over when you mess with their family. Victoria and Chase returned from their island paradise on a Wednesday. I know this because I'd been obsessively checking her social media, watching them blow my son's surgery money on jet skiing, private beach dinners, and bottles of champagne that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Every post felt like a knife twisting in my gut, but I needed to know when they'd be back. I didn't tell Blake what had happened. The kid had been looking forward to this surgery for months, talking excitedly about joining the school soccer team afterward, and asking if he'd finally be able to swim without getting exhausted after just a few minutes. How do you explain to a 7-year-old that his aunt stole his chance at a normal life so she could go on vacation? Instead, I told Blake I had to run some errands and dropped him off with Garrett, my best friend since high school. Garrett is the only person in my life who has never let me down. Not once. He works construction and understands what it means to bust your ass for your family. He didn't ask any questions when I showed up at his door looking like I was about to commit murder. Just keep Blake busy for a few hours, I told him, trying to keep my voice steady. I need to handle something. Garrett took one look at my face and nodded without hesitation. You need backup? Not yet. Cool. When you decide to bury the bodies, I know a guy with a backhoe. The drive to Victoria's place felt like it took forever and no time at all. She lives in one of those luxury apartment complexes with a doorman and valet parking, the kind of place that screams, "I have money" to everyone who sees it. I knew the access code because I'd helped her move in last year when she was between financial situations, which apparently meant she was between scams. I didn't knock. I used the spare key she'd given me for emergencies, walked right into their penthouse apartment, and found them unpacking designer luggage. They were talking and laughing like they didn't have a care in the world, like they hadn't just destroyed a child's future for their own entertainment. Victoria saw me first and froze with a Louis Vuitton bag halfway out of a suitcase, expensive sunglasses still pushed up on her head like some kind of crown. But she didn't look guilty, not even a little bit. If anything, she looked annoyed that I'd interrupted her unpacking. "Oh, Derek! Perfect timing," she said, with that fake, cheerful voice she uses when she's about to manipulate someone. "Actually, I was going to call you later. Chase and I had the most amazing revelation on our trip. We realized that hoarding money creates negative energy blocks, and the universe was telling us to redistribute that stagnant wealth." I stared at her, waiting for the punchline, waiting for her to break character and admit what she'd done. But she just stood there with that serene, self-satisfied expression that told me she genuinely believed her own bullshit. "Where's my money, Victoria?" She rolled her eyes. Victoria actually rolled her eyes at me like I was some annoying child asking for candy. "God, Derek, you're so dramatic," she said, with that condescending tone she'd perfected in college. "It's not your money. It's family money, and we invested it in experiences and spiritual growth, which benefits everyone in the long run." Chase stepped up behind her, all 6 feet 2 inches of yoga-sculpted privilege and smug superiority. This guy who'd never worked a real day in his life, who made money convincing desperate people that crystals could cure their depression. "Dude, your whole vibe right now is super toxic," Chase said, shaking his head like he was disappointed in me. "You're radiating some serious negative energy." I was across the room before either of them could blink, getting right in Chase's face, close enough that he could probably smell the rage coming off me in waves. "You want to talk about toxic?" Let's talk about stealing $118,000 from a sick kid. First of all, Victoria said, examining her perfectly manicured nails like we were discussing the weather, Blake's not dying. He's been fine for 7 years. This surgery is basically cosmetic at this point. You just want him to be perfect instead of accepting him as he is. Cosmetic? I spun around so fast she actually stumbled backward into their imported Italian furniture. He can't walk upstairs without collapsing. He turns blue when he runs around with other kids. And that makes him special and unique, she said, with that patronizing smile that made me want to put my fist through their floor-to-ceiling windows. But you're too shallow to appreciate that. You'd rather spend a fortune trying to make him normal instead of celebrating his differences. Chase nodded along like she'd just shared some profound wisdom. Victoria's right, man. Your attachment to conventional ideas of health is really limiting your growth as a parent. Maybe Blake doesn't need to be fixed. I shoved Chase hard enough to send him stumbling into their granite kitchen island. Hard enough that he knocked over a bottle of wine that probably cost more than my car payment. Don't even think about giving me parenting advice, pretty boy, I snarled. This is between me and my thieving sister. It's not theft when it's redistributing family wealth, Victoria said. But she was backing toward the sliding glass doors now, finally sensing that maybe her spiritual enlightenment wasn't going to protect her from my anger. Honestly, Derek, I'm disappointed in how selfish you've become. You've been hoarding that money for years while Chase and I have been struggling. Struggling? I shouted loud enough that their upstairs neighbors probably heard every word. You live in a penthouse. You drive a BMW. You spend more on skincare products than I spend on groceries for a month. That's completely different, she sniffed, lifting her chin like she was addressing someone beneath her station. That's maintaining our image so we can attract abundance into our lives. What you were doing was just greed. Chase tried to put himself between us again, which was the second biggest mistake he'd made that day. The first was stealing from my son. I grabbed him by his overpriced organic cotton shirt, twisted the fabric up in my fist, and slammed him against the wall hard enough to knock a framed photo of them doing yoga on some beach loose from its mounting. Your girlfriend just called saving for my son's surgery greed, I said, my voice deadly quiet now. You want to defend that? Look, maybe Blake doesn't need to be fixed, Chase said, his voice shaking now as he realized how deep he'd stepped in it. Maybe the universe gave him that heart condition for a reason. I saw red. Literally saw red flooding my vision like someone had poured paint across my eyes. This piece of shit was actually telling me that my son's potentially fatal heart defect was some kind of cosmic lesson plan. Say that again, I whispered, tightening my grip on his shirt until my knuckles went white. I dare you. Tell me again that my kid is supposed to suffer because the universe planned it that way. Victoria stepped forward like she was doing me some kind of favor, like she was the reasonable one trying to defuse a situation. Derek, we're trying to help you, she said, with that infuriating calm that spiritual con artists use when they're about to drop their biggest load of bullshit. This obsession with fixing Blake is really just about your own ego. You can't accept that you have an imperfect child. Imperfect? I let go of Chase and turned back to her, feeling something dangerous and cold settling in my chest. Your healing trip just killed my son's chance at a normal life. Do you get that? The surgery was scheduled for next week. Next week, Victoria, and now I have to call the hospital and tell them we can't pay. Victoria actually shrugged, like we were discussing a canceled dinner reservation instead of my child's future. There will be other opportunities, she said, with that airy dismissiveness that rich people use when other people's problems don't affect them. You're young, you can save again. But Chase and I needed this trip right now. Our chakras were completely blocked, and we were on the verge of a spiritual breakdown. He's 7 years old, Victoria. 7. I could hear my own voice getting louder, could feel the control I'd been holding onto for the past few days finally starting to crack. He doesn't have time for me to save again. This was it. This was his shot. You're being so dramatic, she said, waving her hand dismissively like she was shooing away a fly. Blake will be fine. Kids are resilient. But if Chase and I had waited any longer for our healing journey, we might have had permanent spiritual damage. I looked around their apartment, really taking it in for the first time. The imported furniture that cost more than most people's cars. The wine collection displayed like trophies. The electronic gadgets scattered around like expensive toys. All of it bought with money that was supposed to give my kid a future. Here's what's going to happen, I said, my voice deadly quiet now. You're going to wire every penny back to my account today, right now, or I'm calling the police and pressing charges. Victoria laughed. She actually laughed at me, throwing her head back like I'd just told the funniest joke she'd ever heard. "Oh, please, Derek," she said, still giggling. "You're not going to call the police on your own sister. That's not how our family works. Besides, what we did wasn't really illegal. It was more like an unauthorized loan. Watch me." I pulled out my phone and started dialing 911. Wait! Chase grabbed my arm, which was another mistake in a day full of them. I jerked away and got right back in his face. "Touch me again, and you'll be eating hospital food through a straw." "The money's gone," Victoria said, like she was telling me it was raining outside. Most of it anyway. The resort was $2,800 a night. The flights were first class. We did some shopping on the way back. We deserve to experience luxury for once. I stared at them for a full 10 seconds, letting that sink in. These two people had just destroyed my son's future for a vacation they'd forget about in 6 months. "Then you just destroyed your nephew's life for a vacation you'll forget about in 6 months, I said, my voice so calm it surprised even me. "Oh, stop being so melodramatic," Victoria said, rolling her eyes again like this was all just an inconvenience to her day. "Blake will survive. I survived plenty of disappointments as a child, and look how successful I am now." I didn't say another word. I walked out of their apartment, down to the lobby, and called the police from my truck. I gave them all the account information, transaction details, everything I had. I authorized them to pursue every possible avenue of investigation. By the time I got back to Garrett's place to pick up Blake, there was already a detective assigned to the case. Garrett was waiting on his porch with Blake, who was playing with Garrett's dog and looking happier than he had in weeks. The sight of my son laughing, completely unaware that his future had just been stolen, almost broke me right there. "How'd it go?" Garrett asked quietly when Blake was out of earshot. "She spent it all," I said, still barely believing it myself. "Called Blake's surgery cosmetic and said his heart condition makes him spiritually special." Garrett stared at me for a second, then shook his head slowly. "Your sister's dumber than a box of rocks, isn't she? And that's insulting to the rocks." The next morning, I knew I had to call my parents. I had to, right? Surely they'd be as horrified as any decent human being would be when they learned what their daughter had done. Surely they'd want to help fix this disaster that had torn our family apart. "Yeah, I'm an idiot," Dad answered on the second ring, and I laid out everything. I told him about Blake's surgery being canceled, about the detective who'd been assigned to the case, about the federal charges I was planning to file. I explained how Victoria had justified stealing from her own nephew by claiming it was spiritual redistribution of family wealth. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then, "Son, Victoria called us this morning. She explained the whole situation from her perspective." My stomach dropped. "What do you mean, her perspective?" "I think you're misunderstanding what happened here," Dad continued, in that careful tone he used when he was about to say something he knew would piss me off. "Misunderstanding? Dad, she admitted to stealing the money. She told me to my face that she spent it on vacation." "Now, hold on," he said, and I could hear Mom in the background telling him to put me on speaker. "That's not how she tells it. Victoria says you've been hoarding that money for years, never sharing with family when people needed help. She says you refused to lend her money for her business ventures multiple times, so she was forced to take matters into her own hands. I had to pull over. I actually had to stop driving because I couldn't see straight, couldn't process what I was hearing. Forced? Dad, she stole my son's surgery money to go on vacation with her boyfriend. Well, maybe if you'd been more generous with family over the years, this wouldn't have happened," he said. And I could hear that familiar tone of disappointment that had followed me through my entire childhood. "Victoria's been struggling financially while you've had over $100,000 just sitting in an account. That doesn't seem very fair to the rest of us." "Blake could die without this surgery," I said, my voice getting louder despite my efforts to stay calm. "Victoria's career consists of scamming people with chakra readings." Mom got on the phone next, already crying with that manipulative sob she'd perfected over decades of getting her way through emotional blackmail. "Derek, sweetheart, Victoria explained everything to us," she said between sniffles. "She said you've been using Blake's condition to guilt the family into giving you money for years. And when we stopped falling for it, you started hoarding everything for yourself." "What?" "Mom, I never asked any of you for money. Not once. I've been working overtime for 6 years to save this myself." "Well, Victoria says that's not true," Mom continued, her voice taking on that stubborn edge that meant she'd already made up her mind. "She says you've been manipulating everyone with sob stories about Blake. And when she finally stood up to you, you decided to get revenge by involving the police." "She spent the money on vacation, Mom. luxury resorts and shopping sprees. Victoria says Blake doesn't really need this surgery, Mom replied, completely ignoring what I'd just told her. She says you're just trying to make him perfect because you can't accept having a special needs child. Mom, he can't breathe properly. He turns blue when he exercises. Well, maybe that's just how God made him, honey, she said with that pious tone she used whenever she wanted to end a conversation. Maybe you should learn to accept that instead of trying to play God with expensive surgeries. I hung up because I could feel my brain starting to short circuit. I couldn't process that my own parents had bought into Victoria's narrative so completely that they were willing to sacrifice their grandson's health to protect their daughter's reputation. I drove straight to Garrett's house because I needed someone sane to talk to before I completely lost my mind. Garrett was in his garage working on his motorcycle when I pulled up. He took one look at my face and set down his wrench. Let me guess, he said, wiping his hands on a rag. Your parents took Princess Victoria's side? I told him everything. The phone call, their complete dismissal of Blake's medical needs, their willingness to believe Victoria's lies over their own grandson's welfare. Garrett listened without interrupting, his expression getting darker with every word. Your family's got more screws loose than my motorcycle after a head-on collision, he said when I finished. And that's saying something because this thing barely runs. 2 hours later, my phone rang again. Dad's number. Son, your mother and I have been talking, he said in that careful tone that meant they'd reached some kind of decision. We think the best solution is for you to drop the charges and work this out as a family. Victoria's willing to pay you back over time, but only if you stop this legal nonsense. Over time? The surgery was supposed to be next week. Well, maybe Blake's supposed to stay the way he is, Dad said, and I could hear the finality in his voice. You know what they say. God doesn't give you more than you can handle. You know what, Dad? Screw all of you. None of you give a damn about my kid. I hung up again and immediately blocked both of their numbers. Garrett shook his head. Your family's got more screws loose than flat earthers at a science convention. And that's saying something. That afternoon, I got a text from Victoria. Mom and Dad explained how hurt you are. I'm willing to forgive you for overreacting and calling the police if you're ready to have a mature conversation about this. I showed the message to Garrett, who read it and started laughing. She's willing to forgive you? He said, still chuckling. For calling the police on someone who stole your kid's surgery money? Victoria's got balls, I'll give her that. Too bad she doesn't have a brain to go with them. Garrett showed up at my apartment the morning after I hung up on half my family, carrying coffee and wearing the kind of determined expression that meant he'd been thinking all night and had come up with a plan. All right, here's the deal, he said, before I could even say good morning. I talked to my boss last night. The company's got an emergency hardship fund for employees. It covers medical stuff when insurance falls short or fails completely. It's not enough for the whole surgery, but it's a start. Garrett, I can't ask you to... You're not asking, I'm telling, he interrupted, setting the coffee down on my kitchen counter with the kind of finality that meant arguing would be useless. Blake's getting that surgery. Period. Turns out Garrett had been busier than a one-legged cat in a sandbox. He'd called his church, this mega church that actually does useful stuff with their money instead of just buying the pastor another private jet. He'd reached out to the local HVAC union about their benevolent fund. He'd even contacted the Children's Hospital directly about payment plans and charitable programs they might have available. By noon, we had a plan that was crazy enough to actually work. The hospital's financial aid program would cover about 40% of the cost if we could prove financial hardship, which wouldn't be difficult given that my entire savings account had been cleaned out by my own sister. Garrett's company fund would kick in another $23,000. The union's emergency assistance program was good for $14,000 more for members in crisis situations. The church was organizing a fundraiser that could potentially raise another significant chunk of money. Garrett had already spoken to the pastor, who was apparently outraged that someone would steal a child's medical fund and wanted to help however possible. We were still left about $28,000 short of the total, but the hospital agreed to let Blake have the surgery if we could pay half up front and set up a payment plan for the rest. The interest rate was brutal, and the terms were going to stretch my budget to the breaking point, but it was doable with my overtime income. Blake's surgery got rescheduled for the following Tuesday. When I told him, he lit up like Christmas morning and immediately started talking about all the things he'd be able to do afterward. It broke my heart and filled me with hope at the same time. I filed the official police report that Friday. The detectives assigned to the case seemed like genuinely good people, thorough, professional, and visibly angry when I explained how the money had been stolen. Detective Martinez, the lead investigator, was particularly outraged. Financial crimes against family members are some of the most sickening cases I deal with, she told me as she took my statement. People think because they're related, the normal rules don't apply. But theft is theft, regardless of DNA. She also explained that because the money had been transferred to an offshore account, this was now federal territory. The FBI would be getting involved. Victoria wasn't just looking at state charges anymore. She was facing federal wire fraud charges, which carried much more serious penalties. When I told Garrett about the federal charges, he grinned like he'd just won the lottery. "Oh man, Victoria's about to find out that orange really isn't the new black," he said, shaking his head. "It's just orange, and it doesn't come in designer brands." Monday night, Garrett stayed over so he could drive us to the hospital in the morning. We ordered pizza, watched some movies with Blake, and tried to keep things as normal as possible, even though I was internally freaking out about my kid going under the knife for 6 hours. Around 10 p.m., after Blake was asleep in his bed, Garrett and I were sitting on my tiny balcony sharing a beer, and he asked the question I'd been dreading. "You heard from your family at all since you blocked their numbers?" "Yeah, they managed to get through on Victoria's phone," I said, taking a long sip of beer. "They want me to drop the charges because Victoria is willing to forgive my overreaction." Garrett nearly choked on his drink. "She's willing to forgive you?" "Apparently, I'm being selfish and vindictive by involving the police in what should be handled as a private family disagreement." Garrett stared at me for a long moment, then shook his head slowly. "Jesus Christ, Derek. These people are more delusional than people who think birds aren't real. And that's saying something because at least those conspiracy theorists have seen actual birds." Surgery day was absolutely surreal. We had to be at the hospital at 5 a.m. for pre-op preparation, which meant getting Blake up at 4 o'clock in the morning. He was nervous, but trying so hard to be brave, asking a million questions about the anesthesia, whether he'd have a big scar afterward, and if the doctors had steady hands. "Dad, do you think they drink coffee before they operate?" he asked, while we were driving through the empty streets. "Because my teacher says her hands shake when she has too much coffee." "I'm sure they're very careful about that, buddy," I told him, trying to keep my own voice steady. Garrett stayed through the entire 6-hour procedure, sitting in those uncomfortable waiting room chairs, fetching coffee when I needed it, playing cards to keep me distracted, and making terrible jokes to prevent me from losing my mind completely. "You know what the difference is between your sister and a parking meter?" Garrett asked around hour 3, dealing out another hand of cards. "What's that?" "A parking meter actually gives you something useful for your money." Around hour 4, my phone buzzed with a text message. I almost didn't look at it, but something made me check. It was from Victoria. "I heard Blake's having surgery today, sending light and love from Chase and me. We're manifesting perfect healing energy for him. Light and love from the woman who'd stolen his surgery money." I showed Garrett the message, and he read it with an expression of complete disbelief. "Want me to respond for you?" he asked, cracking his knuckles. "Already blocked her number," I said. "But I'd love to hear what you would have sent back." Garrett looked at the blocked message notification and grinned. "I would have sent back, manifest yourself some bail money. You're going to need it." At 2:47 p.m., the surgeon finally came out to the waiting room. He was still wearing his surgical scrubs and looked exhausted, but he was smiling, which I took as a good sign. "The surgery went absolutely perfectly," he said, and I felt like I could breathe properly for the first time in weeks. "Blake's heart is functioning better than we even dared hope for. Recovery will take a few weeks, but he's going to have a completely normal life from here on out." Garrett pumped his fist like his favorite team had just won the Super Bowl. "Hell yeah, that's what I'm talking about. Take that, universe." Blake woke up around 6 p.m., still groggy from the anesthesia, but already breathing easier than I'd seen him breathe in his entire life. The difference was immediate and dramatic. "Dad, I feel like I can breathe with my whole body," he whispered, his voice still hoarse from the breathing tube. My phone stayed completely silent all evening. No calls from my parents asking how their grandson was doing after major heart surgery. No texts from Victoria checking on her nephew's recovery. No family members who'd suddenly remembered that Blake existed. But Garrett was there, and honestly, that meant more to me than anything my blood relatives could have said or done. Sometimes friendship really is worth more than DNA. The detective called me 3 days after Blake's surgery. My kid was home recovering beautifully, his color finally looking normal for the first time in his life, and he was actually excited about starting physical therapy to build up his strength. I was sitting on the couch, finally relaxing for the first time in weeks, when my phone rang. "Mr. Brown, I think you need to come down to the station," Detective Martinez said. "We've uncovered some things about your sister's activities that go way beyond what you initially reported." Turns out Victoria hadn't just stolen my money. She'd been running a whole operation that would have made Bernie Madoff proud. The cybersecurity team that worked with the police had traced her digital footprint going back months, and what they'd found was staggering. The offshore account wasn't her first rodeo. She'd been systematically accessing other family members' financial information for over a year. My cousin Lisa's identity had been used to open credit cards that Lisa never knew existed. My Uncle Robert's business account had been hit with suspicious small withdrawals that he'd written off as bank fees. Even my elderly Aunt Catherine had been targeted. Your sister is looking at multiple counts of identity theft, wire fraud, and financial exploitation, Detective Martinez explained, spreading printouts across her desk like she was laying out evidence for a major case. This isn't just family drama anymore. This is organized criminal activity. The evidence was absolutely overwhelming. They had screenshots of conversations between Victoria and Chase where they actually discussed planning the family fund redistribution. Their words, not mine. They had browser history showing that Victoria had researched how to hide money in offshore accounts and avoid detection. They even had security camera footage from the credit union where she used to work, showing her accessing customer files after hours when she was supposed to be gone. Garrett had insisted on coming with me to this meeting, which turned out to be a good thing because I was ready to explode all over again when I saw the extent of what Victoria had been doing. "So what happens now?" I asked, trying to process the scope of her crimes. "Federal charges are being filed this week," Detective Martinez said. "Your case is just the tip of the iceberg, but it's the most serious because of the amount stolen and the circumstances involved. The prosecutor is particularly motivated when crimes involve stealing from children's medical funds." Garrett leaned back in his chair and shook his head. "So Victoria went from wellness coach to federal criminal. That's like the world's worst career pivot. Even LinkedIn wouldn't know how to spin that transition. My phone had been ringing constantly for 2 days, but not from Victoria or my parents. It was from other family members who were suddenly discovering their own financial irregularities. Apparently, word was spreading through our extended family that Victoria's helpful investment advice and financial planning assistance had actually been covers for systematic theft. Cousin Lisa called me crying because she'd discovered that her credit score had been completely destroyed by credit cards she never knew existed. Uncle Robert found out that his business account was actually $7,500 short over the past 6 months. Money that had been siphoned off in small amounts that he'd assumed were bank fees. Even my elderly Aunt Catherine realized that the bank error that had wiped out her vacation fund wasn't an error at all. But here's the thing that really set me off. The thing that made me want to drive to wherever my parents were hiding and have a very serious conversation with them. My parents knew. They didn't just know. They had encouraged Victoria to steal from me. Detective Martinez showed me text messages that the FBI had recovered from Victoria's phone. Messages between her and my mother that were dated 3 weeks before Blake's surgery was originally scheduled. Victoria: "The money transfer went through. Derek will never notice until it's too late. Mom: Good. Maybe this will teach him not to be so stingy with family. You and Chase deserve that vacation." Victoria: "Exactly. Blake doesn't really need that surgery anyway. Derek's just being dramatic as usual." Mom: "Your father and I agree. We're tired of him using Blake to manipulate everyone. You did the right thing. They didn't just know about the theft. They had actively encouraged it. They thought Victoria was teaching me some kind of lesson about being selfish with money, and they were perfectly willing to sacrifice their grandson's health to make that point." Garrett read those messages over my shoulder and went absolutely ballistic. He started using language that would make a construction worker blush, and Detective Martinez actually had to ask him to step outside for a minute to cool down. When he came back, Garrett was still shaking his head in disbelief. "Your parents are dumber than a bag of hammers," he said. "And I sincerely apologize to hammers everywhere for that comparison. I want to press charges against my parents too," I told Detective Martinez when Garrett had calmed down. "Conspiracy or accessory or whatever you call it when someone helps plan a crime. The text messages definitely show knowledge and encouragement of the criminal activity," she said, studying the printouts. "But proving legal conspiracy can be challenging. However, they could definitely be called as witnesses in Victoria's trial, and these messages would be entered as evidence." That was enough for me. My parents wanted to protect Victoria's reputation and maintain family harmony? Perfect. Let them explain to a federal court why they thought helping steal from their grandson was an example of good family values. I authorized the detective to pursue every possible charge against Victoria and Chase. No mercy, no family discounts, No consideration for keeping things quiet to protect anyone's reputation. Victoria had declared war on my son's future, and now she was going to face the full consequences of her actions. Garrett came back into the interview room looking calmer but still furious. So when do they actually arrest her? Federal agents are executing warrants tomorrow morning, Detective Martinez said. Miss Brown and Mr. Chase will both be taken into custody simultaneously. Garrett grinned like it was Christmas morning. Oh, this is going to be beautiful. Victoria is about to learn that federal prison doesn't have a juice bar or yoga classes. I wish I could say I felt bad about it. I wish I could say that some part of me was sad about my sister getting arrested and facing serious prison time. But all I felt was cold, hard satisfaction. You don't steal from kids with heart conditions and get to walk away unscathed. Not in my world. The detective called me at 7:23 a.m. the next morning. Blake was eating breakfast, actually eating a full meal without getting tired halfway through for the first time in his life, when my phone rang. They're in custody, both of them, Detective Martinez said. FBI executed warrants at 6 a.m. sharp. What happens next? Arraignment this afternoon. They'll probably try to post bail, but given the flight risk factor and the offshore accounts involved, the prosecutor is requesting they be held pending trial. Garrett had stayed over again the night before because Blake still needed help with some basic activities while his chest healed from the surgery. He was making coffee when I hung up the phone, and I just nodded at him. It's done. Garrett grinned like he'd just won the lottery. About damn time. Victoria's about to find out that orange jumpsuits don't come in designer brands. The news hit social media within hours. Apparently, federal arrests are public record, and Victoria's former boss at the credit union had friends who worked in law enforcement. By noon, everyone in our extended family knew that the golden child was sitting in federal lockup. My phone started buzzing like an angry beehive. Cousins, aunts, uncles, family friends. Suddenly, everyone wanted to talk to me. Suddenly, everyone was so sorry and had no idea what Victoria was really like. Suddenly, everyone had always thought something was off about her behavior, but just couldn't put their finger on it. It's funny how that works, isn't it? When she was stealing from me, it was private family business that should be handled quietly without involving outsiders. But when she got arrested by federal agents, suddenly everyone had strong opinions about what a terrible person she'd always been. I didn't answer any of those calls. I was done with fair-weather family members who only showed up when the drama was juicy enough to entertain them. The silence from my parents was absolutely deafening. No calls, no texts, no concerned voicemails asking how Blake was recovering from his surgery. Just complete radio silence, like they were hoping if they ignored the situation long enough, it would just go away. That evening, Garrett and I were watching TV while Blake did his breathing exercises, part of his recovery routine to strengthen his cardiovascular system, when someone started pounding on my door. Hard, aggressive knocking that sounded like someone was trying to break the door down. It was Chase's parents. I opened the door to find two people who looked like they'd just lost their life savings in a pyramid scheme. Chase's dad was red-faced and sweating despite the cool evening air. His mom looked like she'd been crying for hours. "You destroyed our son's life," she said before I could even say hello, pointing an accusatory finger at my chest. "Your son destroyed my son's life first," I replied calmly. "He just happened to get caught." Chase's dad stepped forward, clearly trying to intimidate me with his presence. Bad move. I've been working around high-voltage electrical systems for 8 years. Suburban dads in polo shirts don't scare me. Chase said that money belonged to the whole family, he said, puffing out his chest. Victoria explained how you've been hoarding it while everyone else struggled financially. Actually, I saved every penny of that money through 6 years of overtime work, I said. It's called ownership. The money was mine. They stole it. Now they're in jail. Simple math. But Chase's business is completely ruined, his mom wailed. His clients are abandoning him left and right. You could have just worked this out privately instead of destroying his reputation. Garrett appeared behind me, clearly having heard enough. Yeah, because nothing says private family matter like federal wire fraud charges. You might want to get Chase a good lawyer instead of harassing his victims. He should have thought about that before he spent stolen money on vacation, I added. Chase's mom started crying harder, like somehow her tears were going to make me feel guilty about their son facing consequences for his actions. Victoria told us you've been using Blake's condition to manipulate the family for years, she sobbed. She said you refused to help anyone else and just kept hoarding money out of pure greed. Garrett stepped forward, his patience clearly exhausted. Lady, your son helped steal surgery money from a 7-year-old with a heart condition. Maybe don't take family advice from people who are currently facing federal charges. I looked at these two people who had completely bought into Victoria's narrative, even after their son got arrested for federal crimes. Even after all the evidence came out in court. Ma'am, your son helped steal $118,000 from my 7-year-old's medical fund, I said, as calmly as I could manage. Victoria could tell you the moon is made of cheese, but that doesn't make your son any less of a thief. I closed the door and locked it behind me. Garrett was standing there shaking his head. Those people are more delusional than anti-vaxxers at a measles convention. That night, my parents finally called. Not to check on Blake's recovery from major heart surgery. Not to apologize for encouraging Victoria to steal from their grandson. But to yell at me for destroying the family. Victoria's in jail because of you, Dad said, his voice shaking with rage. Our daughter is sitting in a cell while you're at home feeling satisfied with yourself. Your daughter is sitting in a cell because she committed federal crimes, I replied. Multiple federal crimes, apparently. She made a mistake. Family is supposed to forgive mistakes, not destroy each other over them. Stealing $118,000 from a sick child isn't a mistake, Dad. It's a felony. Mom got on the phone, already crying with that manipulative sob she'd used to control situations my entire childhood. Derek, Victoria says the other inmates are being mean to her, she wailed. She's not built for this kind of environment. Please just drop the charges and let her come home. She should have thought about that before she robbed her nephew. Stop saying that, Mom screamed. Stop calling it robbery! She was trying to help the family! I hung up and immediately blocked both of their numbers. I was done enabling their delusions. 6 months later, Blake is running around like a completely normal kid. He's playing soccer, riding his bike, doing all the things he could never do before without collapsing from exhaustion. The surgery was a complete success, and his cardiologist says his heart function is now well within the normal range for a child his age. The kid has energy I didn't even know was possible. Last week he asked if he could try out for the travel soccer team, and for the first time in his life, I didn't have to worry about whether his heart could handle it. Victoria and Chase's trial was everything I'd hoped for, and more. The prosecutor didn't mess around. Federal court doesn't play games with wire fraud, identity theft, conspiracy, and financial exploitation of vulnerable people. The evidence was absolutely overwhelming. Digital trails showing every transaction, bank records going back months, those damning text messages between Victoria and my parents, and witness testimony from all the other family members she'd stolen from over the past year. Victoria tried to play the victim card right up until sentencing. Her lawyer argued that she was under emotional distress, that family financial arrangements were complicated, and that she'd been guided by spiritual principles to redistribute wealth inequality within the family unit. Even during her own trial, Victoria remained completely unrepentant. When the prosecutor asked her directly why she stole Blake's surgery money, she actually said, "I was helping my brother release his attachment to material possessions. Children with heart conditions are often spiritually gifted, and surgical intervention can interfere with their karmic development." Garrett was sitting in the gallery behind me and whispered, "This lady's nuttier than a squirrel's breakfast." The judge looked at Victoria like she'd just grown a second head. Chase's testimony was somehow even worse than Victoria's. He claimed with a straight face that they'd invested the stolen funds in healing energy that would benefit the entire family system. When pressed by the prosecutor to provide specifics about these expenses, Chase proudly listed first-class flights, luxury resort stays, and $2,700 worth of consciousness-expanding crystals as legitimate investments in family healing modalities. Garrett leaned over and whispered, $2,700 for rocks. I could have given him the same spiritual experience by hitting him in the head with a brick for free. The judge wasn't buying any of their New Age nonsense. When it came time for sentencing, he didn't hold back. "Miss Brown," he said, looking directly at Victoria with barely concealed disgust, "you systematically stole money that was earmarked for a child's life-saving surgery. Then you spent that money on personal luxuries while justifying your actions with pseudo-scientific nonsense. You've shown absolutely zero remorse and continue to blame the victim for your crimes. This court finds your actions particularly heinous given the vulnerability of the victim and your complete lack of accountability." Victoria got 4 years in federal prison, full restitution, and 5 years of probation after her release. Chase got 3 years as an accessory and for money laundering the stolen funds through his business accounts. But here's where the story gets really satisfying. The trial was public record, and local news outlets picked up the story because Sister steals nephew's heart surgery money for spiritual vacation is exactly the kind of headline that writes itself. Regional newspapers ran with it. Social media absolutely exploded with outrage. Garrett sent me screenshots of comment sections that had me laughing until my sides hurt. "Look at this one," he said, showing me his phone. "This guy says Victoria is the reason aliens won't visit Earth. And this woman says Chase looks like he gets his business advice from a magic 8-ball. Victoria's wellness coaching business evaporated overnight. Turns out people don't want life advice from someone who steals from sick children while claiming it's for their spiritual development. Who could have predicted that? Chase's consulting firm lost every single client within 2 weeks of the story breaking. His business partner publicly dissolved their LLC and put out a statement distancing himself from the entire mess. My parents got absolutely dragged through the mud by association. Those text messages between Victoria and my mother became evidence in open court, which meant they became public record. Local papers quoted them directly. Blake doesn't really need that surgery anyway, and maybe this will teach him not to be so stingy with family. The country club they'd belonged to for 15 years quietly asked them not to renew their membership. Dad's golf buddies started avoiding him like he had a contagious disease. Mom's book club kicked her out after the other members read about her involvement in the local paper. Even their neighbors stopped waving when they drove by. They tried reaching out to me after the trial ended. They sent Blake a birthday card with a long, rambling note about how they'd been misled by Victoria's spiritual teachings and wanted to make amends for supporting her misguided actions. I returned it unopened. Garrett was with me when the mail came back to my apartment. "You feel bad about that at all?" "Not even a little bit." "Good," he said, nodding approvingly. They had their chance to be decent grandparents. Instead, they chose to be Victoria's enablers. That's like choosing to be a mosquito when you could be a butterfly. The absolute best part of this entire saga? Blake doesn't even remember most of the drama. To him, it's just a story about how he got his surgery and became able to play sports like other kids. He doesn't know about the family betrayal or the court proceedings or any of the ugliness that adults created around his medical needs. Last weekend, he scored 2 goals in his soccer game and ran the entire field without stopping, without getting winded, without that terrifying blue tinge around his lips that used to make my heart stop with worry. After the game, he was bouncing with excitement. "Can I try out for the travel team next year, Dad? I think I'm fast enough now." "Yeah, buddy," I told him, ruffling his hair. "I think you're fast enough for anything you want to do." Garrett was at the game, too, cheering louder than anyone else in the stands. He's been Blake's honorary uncle through this whole ordeal, never missing a school event or a medical appointment, always showing up when we needed him most. Meanwhile, Victoria is sitting in federal prison, wearing orange jumpsuits, still insisting to anyone who will listen that she was spiritually guided to steal from her nephew. Apparently, she's become something of a pariah even among the other inmates, which is saying something when convicted, felons think your crimes are morally reprehensible. Chase is living in his parents' basement, unemployed and essentially unemployable. Word has gotten around their social circles about what he did, and he's telling anyone who will listen that he's a victim of collective consciousness persecution. Even his yoga instructor dropped him as a client. My parents are complete pariahs in their own social circle. They're known throughout their community as the people who encouraged their daughter to steal surgery money from their grandson. Their reputation is destroyed, their friendships are over, and they have no one to blame but themselves. And me? I'm sitting here watching my kid run around a soccer field with a perfectly functioning heart, surrounded by people who actually give a damn about us. Garrett summed it up perfectly after Blake's last game. "Your real family is right here, man," he said, watching Blake celebrate with his teammates. "Everyone else was just practice." Looking back on everything that happened, I realized this story isn't really about revenge, even though that's how it might seem. It's about learning the difference between the people who are related to you by blood and the people who are actually your family. Blood doesn't make someone family. Loyalty does. Love does. Showing up when it matters does. Victoria thought she could steal from a sick child and face no consequences because we shared DNA. My parents thought they could enable her theft and maintain their relationships with everyone involved. They all learned that actions have consequences, regardless of family connections. But more importantly, I learned that Blake and I aren't alone in this world. We have Garrett, who dropped everything to help us when we needed it most. We have the church community that rallied around a stranger's medical bills. We have the union brothers who contributed to a fund for a coworker's kid. We have medical professionals who worked with us on payment plans because they believed every child deserves a chance at a healthy life. That's real family, that's what matters. Blake's heart works perfectly now. He runs, he plays, he laughs without turning blue. He's growing up believing that when bad things happen, good people show up to help. He's learning that integrity matters more than blood relations, and that the people who love you will move mountains to keep you safe. Victoria can keep her spiritual enlightenment and her victim complex. Chase can keep his crystals and his conspiracy theories. My parents can keep their wounded pride and their social isolation. I've got everything I need right here. A healthy kid, a best friend who's more of a brother than my actual sister ever was, and the knowledge that we fought for what mattered and won. That's enough revenge for me. Update. For those asking in the comments, yes, Blake is doing amazingly well. His latest cardiology appointment showed completely normal heart function. He made the travel soccer team and is already talking about trying out for basketball next season. Sometimes justice really does work out exactly the way it should. And to the people suggesting I should forgive my family for Blake's sake, Blake is thriving without toxic people in his life. The best thing I ever did for my son was show him that some boundaries are non-negotiable, even with family, especially with family.